The Destiny War has erupted across the universe. The Toa Nuva are locked in battle against a full-scale Makuta invasion of Karda Nui, fighting to awaken the Great Spirit Mata Nui before it's too late. After 100,000 years of secrecy, the Order of Mata Nui, led by Toa Helrix, has finally emerged from the shadows, waging open war against the Brotherhood. Their forces have recruited the Dark Hunters, turning old enemies into temporary allies in their desperate struggle. Zia, the once powerful arms supplier of the Makuta, has fallen to the Dark Hunters. Meanwhile, the Toa Haga have been sent on a dangerous mission to track down Makuta Teridax, whose essence now lurks in an ancient system linked to Mata Nui himself. But despite these victories, the Brotherhood of Makuta still holds the upper hand. Its legions of Rakshi, shadow-powered warriors, and centuries of cunning make them a near insurmountable force. If the Order of Mata Nui has any hope of winning, they must take drastic measures. That means turning to the unlikeliest of allies, beings who are sworn enemies of the Toa, outcasts and villains feared across the universe. Today, we follow the story of the Federation of Fear, a ragtag crew of the most dangerous criminals and outcasts ever assembled. Forced together under the command of Brutaka, this group of treacherous misfits has been given a single task: embark on a perilous mission that could tip the balance of power in the war. They despise each other. They can't be trusted. And yet, they might be the universe's last hope. Vezon woke with a start, half expecting to find himself torn apart. Instead, he was lying on the cold floor of a prison cell, still very much alive and intact. When we last saw Vezon, he was attacking the Toa Inika in the cord, linking Voya Nui to Mari Nui. But after being defeated, he had been whisked away by Zyglak, his doom almost certain. His last memory was of the savage creatures closing in, followed by a sudden flash of light and the feeling of being yanked away by an unseen force. Now, he was somewhere else, wherever that was. The cell was large, dimly lit, and filled with 4 other captives. Vezon didn't recognize any of them, but that didn't stop him from calculating how quickly he could take them down and whether he could pick the lock before anyone noticed. Before he could act, heavy footsteps echoed from outside. A tall figure clad in dark armor stepped into view, a curved, double-bladed sword resting on his back. Even with the helmet obscuring his face, there was no mistaking who it was: Brutaka. Once a rogue, Brutaka had redeemed himself by stealing the Staff of Artaka from Makuta Teridax. Now reinstated within the Order of Mata Nui, he had assembled a group of prisoners, each with a past tied to the Brotherhood of Makuta, whether as enemies, allies, or victims. Brutaka explained that the Order of Mata Nui had intervened, snatching Vezon away before the savage creatures could finish him. He also introduced Vezon to the other prisoners. First there was Takadox and Carapar, 2 of the 6 Barraki warlords. They had vanished during the Barraki's final battle with the Tuamari. The remaining warlords had presumed them dead, another casualty in their long struggle for power. But, in reality, Brutaka had taken them for reasons yet unknown. Next he introduced Roodaka, the treacherous Vortixx who once engineered the fall of the Toa Haga and played both sides in the war between the Dark Hunters and the Brotherhood. She had been captured during the Order's assault on Zia and taken in by Brutaka. And finally, there was Spiriah, the disgraced Makuta, who had spent centuries in exile after his disastrous attempt to transform the Skakti into an army. Now they were all here, gathered in a single cell, under the watchful eye of Brutaka. They had once been rulers, manipulators, and outcasts, but the Order had plans for them. Whether they would cooperate willingly or be forced into service was yet to be determined. Brutaka wasted no time. They had 2 options: agree to carry out a mission for the Order, or refuse and face severe consequences. Reluctantly, these disposable assets would form an unlikely alliance under the duress of Brutaka, known as the Federation of Fear. A few days later, Brutaka's team arrived on the shores of Stelt in a small, battered boat. As soon as Roodaka saw the jagged skyline, she had nearly leapt overboard in protest. Stelt was home to Sidorak, her former ally, whom she had coldly betrayed all those years ago. His people would not have forgotten nor forgiven. she was probably the most wanted being on the island, and now Brutaka had brought her right to it. But Brutaka had his reasons for wanting to go to this island. They needed a larger vessel, and this was the easiest place to get one. The group moved into the city, following Brutaka as he led them toward a dingy trading house. The shop's owner, a broad-shouldered Steltian, barely looked up as they entered. Brutaka made his demands. He wanted a fast ship, well supplied for a long voyage south. The trader wasn't impressed. He had no reason to part with a valuable vessel without significant payment. Of course, these were some of the most powerful beings in the Matoran universe and could easily steal a boat. But Brutaka wanted to have some fun. After all, this was the same Brutaka who had teleported a Tartorak to Mata Nui as a joke. With a dramatic gesture, he pulled back Roodaka's hood, revealing her face to the trader. Shock flickered across the Steltian's features, and then a slow grin formed. The infamous traitor of Sidorak had just walked right into his hands. Every being on Stelt would pay a fortune to get their revenge on her. The trader had barely begun calculating his potential reward when Brutaka offered an additional deal. The Steltian wouldn't just get to turn in Roodaka, he would also get to look like a hero doing it. Brutaka explained that a good story required evidence. The trader needed to appear like he had put up a fight before subduing such a deadly foe. The best way to do that? A single, well-placed punch to the head. Vezon eagerly volunteered. The trader, unimpressed by the grinning lunatic, scoffed at the idea. What harm could this scrawny skakti possibly do? Amused, he agreed to the deal. That was when Brutaka struck. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and knocked the Steltian out cold with a single, precise blow. At the docks, another plan had been unfolding. While the trader had been distracted, Takadox had slipped away, making his way to their intended ship. The crew, a collection of large brutish sailors, had been working on deck. One by one, they had walked off the edge and into the sea under Takadox's hypnotic influence. Meanwhile, Roodaka fumed. For a brief moment, she had actually believed Brutaka was handing her over in exchange for a boat. Instead, she had been nothing more than a prop in his little joke, an elaborate setup just to trick the trader into asking for the punch that knocked him out. Worse still, the trader had seen her, recognized her, and now knew she was here. That alone was a risk she was unwilling to tolerate. Carapar too grumbled at the unnecessary theatrics. A direct assault would have been faster, just take the ship by force and be done with it. Brutaka, utterly unconcerned, simply watched as the ship drifted away from shore. The trader, still unconscious, would wake up with a headache and a story no one would ever believe. After all, who would be foolish enough to stand still and ask to be punched in the face? For 3 days, Brutaka's crew had drifted across the vast southern seas, bound for a destination none of them had foreseen. When he finally gathered them together, the truth of their mission was revealed. Their target was an island lost to time, a place so far south it appeared on no known map. But it was not empty, it was a prison. And within it lay a secret that even the Brotherhood of Makuta had long since buried: Miserix. Long before Teridax had seized control, as explored in a previous video, the Brotherhood of Makuta had been ruled by Miserix. But he had only been their leader in name, not in vision. Where he saw duty, Teridax saw conquest. When Teridax devised the grand plan that would reshape the universe, Miserix opposed it, and for that, he was betrayed. The Brotherhood turned against their own leader, and rather than risk open rebellion, they made an example of him. Teridax had ordered Miserix's death, entrusting Makuta Krika with the task, but Krika, perhaps out of pity, had defied that order. Rather than executing his former master, he had hidden him away on a volcanic island, locked behind Rahi and creatures meant to kill anything that dared to escape. For all his meticulous planning, Teridax had never realized that Miserix still lived. The greatest secret of the Brotherhood had been concealed even from its own ruler. And now, Brutaka intended to free him. The implications rattled even the most hardened among the crew. Spiriah, a Makuta who had long feared the wrath of his kind, seemed particularly unsettled. The others, from the war-hardened Barraki to the ever-unpredictable Vezon, remained wary. This was no simple raid. This was a direct challenge to the Brotherhood's rule. Talk of rewards soon followed. Would they be paid or granted power? Brutaka's answer was simple: they would earn the right to live another day. But as the team talked, something loomed on the horizon. Vezon was the first to notice the approaching ships. A ragged fleet drifted in from the west, their patchwork hulls barely holding together. They looked less like seaworthy vessels and more like floating wreckage cobbled together from debris. But it wasn't their shoddy construction that caught his attention. It was who was aboard them. Zyglak. The others rushed to the railing, confirming the sight. The hulking reptilian beings, long shunned as the Great Being's mistakes, were notorious for their hatred of Mata Nui and everything tied to him. They weren't raiders seeking loot, nor mercenaries looking for profit. Zyglak existed to destroy, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. Brutaka acted fast, trying to steer the ship away, but something was wrong. No matter how he adjusted the course, the vessel refused to move as it should. The wind shifted erratically, the waves surged against them, trapping them in place. It wasn't bad luck, it was deliberate. Then he saw the reason why. Spiriah stood near the stern, the energy flickering around him, leaving no doubt. The shifting winds, the treacherous waves, were all his doing. Spiriah saw himself as one of them, an exile cast out by his own kind. The Brotherhood had abandoned him after the disaster on Zakaz, where his grand experiment had backfired spectacularly. He had sought to reshape the Skakti into something greater, but their brutal nature had turned his vision to ruin. His disgrace had been their fault. Now he intended to make the Skakti answer for their failure. Brutaka barely had time to react before Spiriah made his move. This ship was his now. The mission to rescue Miserix was over. They were sailing to Zakaz, where the Federation of Fear would join Makuta Spiriah's Zyglak invasion of the Skakti. Three days had passed under Spiriah's rule. The ship was now bound for Zakaz, flanked on all sides by Zyglak warships. Spiriah reveled in his newfound authority, dictating every course adjustment, every task, every movement of the crew. He especially enjoyed forcing Brutaka to obey, treating him like a slave. Yet Brutaka offered no argument, no resistance, just silent compliance. Roodaka had lost all patience waiting for Brutaka to act, and instead turned her focus to Spiriah. She whispered to him of opportunity. The Brotherhood of Makuta had stretched itself too thin. Too many wars, too many enemies, too much weakness. If he struck now, he could seize Destral itself. The seat of power was ripe for the taking, but such an effort required someone with knowledge, someone who understood alliances, betrayals, and how to turn them into weapons. Someone like her. Spiriah barely acknowledged her, his expression cold with contempt. She was poison, her name synonymous with deceit. Roodaka bit back in anger, muttering that it was better to be known as treacherous than to be known as a failure like Spiriah. Vezon, meanwhile, had embraced their new destination with enthusiasm. He had never set foot on Zakaz, but that didn't stop him from calling it home, with an almost giddy excitement. The island of Zakaz loomed ahead, its jagged coastline barely visible through the morning mist. A lawless wasteland ruled by Skakti warlords. It was a place where brutality reigned and survival depended on the strength of one's blade. A cluster of dark hunter patrol ships loomed ahead, guarding the waters surrounding Zakaz. At a signal from Spiriah, the Zyglak struck. The Dark Hunters never stood a chance. Caught off guard, 3 of their ships were reduced to flaming wreckage within moments. Those who managed to escape the sinking vessels swam frantically towards shore, only to be greeted by hordes of battle-hungry Skakti who quickly finished the job. Spiriah watched with satisfaction as the chaos unfolded. His fleet of Zyglak pushed forward, eager to set foot on land and claim their own share of the carnage. But just as victory seemed inevitable, disaster struck. Without warning, one of the Zyglak ships shuddered violently, then began to sink. Then another and another. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against them. Shapes moved below the surface, too quick to identify. They wove through the wreckage, darting between hulls with unnatural speed, their claws slicing through wood and metal alike. As the Zyglak fleet fell into chaos, Spiriah was too consumed with shock to react in time. But Brutaka wasn't. He struck with lethal precision, hurling a blast of energy that sent Spiriah sprawling to the deck. Before the Makuta could recover, Brutaka was on him, his blade pressed against Spiriah's armor. If Brutaka tore open his armor, his energy would dissipate into the air, leaving nothing behind. Brutaka's voice cut through the din of the dying fleet, calm and measured. Spiriah had assumed he was the only one who had allies. He had been wrong. Brutaka's own contacts had been trailing the ship since they left Stelt, waiting for the right moment to strike. The beings attacking were no ordinary creatures. They were the same species as the Barraki, Elec, beings engineered for one purpose, to kill Makuta. Then, another presence emerged on the waves. A lone skiff approached, cutting through the water with silent precision. The figure aboard handled the craft effortlessly, her movements precise and fluid. Most striking of all was her left arm, entirely mechanical. Brutaka wasted no time in introductions. She was the final member of their team, an assassin whose skills were as feared as they were legendary. Her name was Lariska. A Dark Hunter, she was one of the most feared assassins in the known world. When the Dark Hunters had gone to war with the Brotherhood of Makuta a millennia ago, Lariska had been at the forefront. Now she was here, handpicked for a mission that required intricate knowledge of the Makuta. With Spiriah's rebellion crushed and his fleet obliterated, Brutaka had regained full control of the mission. Zakaz was behind them, but their journey was far from over. There was one more crucial stop to make before they could continue south toward their true objective, one that Brutaka had been dreading. It was time to arm the team. Brutaka had already played his hand, making sure the disgraced Makuta stayed exactly where he was. He had laid out the maths for Spiriah, explaining in gruesome detail how long he would last if he tried anything else. The island they approached was nothing more than a stretch of barren rock, an unremarkable place with no signs of life. It had not been the original destination for this stop, but plans had changed, violently. Originally, the Order of Mata Nui had arranged for two of its members to deliver a weapons cache to a small, wooded island just off the mainland. The operatives in charge were Botar, the towering, fearsome warrior known for his ability to teleport across vast distances, and Trenuma, a 9-foot-tall armored behemoth with the power to level entire battlefields. But before the rendezvous could take place, their presence had been discovered by a Makuta. Icarax, one of the most brutal and war-hardened members of the Brotherhood, had been en route to Mata Nui to reinforce his brethren against the Tornuva. When he spotted the Order's agents, he had wasted no time in launching an attack. The battle was as brief as it was devastating. Icarax, wielding his mastery of magnetism, had crushed Botar with terrifying ease. The warrior's immense strength had meant nothing against the force that had simply twisted and compacted his body like scrap metal. Trenuma had barely managed to escape, wounded and carrying the grim news back to the Order. In the aftermath, Trenuma had hidden the weapons at the first location he could find, fearing that Icarax might still be tracking him. The barren island ahead was where he had left them, an unassuming place unlikely to draw attention. Despite the loss of Botar, the Order of Mata Nui had quickly ensured that their operations would not be hindered. Another member of his species, identical in appearance and ability, had already stepped in to take his place. The transition had been seamless, as if Botar had never fallen at all. For the Federation of Fear though, none of that mattered. What mattered now was retrieving the weapons and preparing for the battle to come. The group waded onto the rocky coastline, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. Brutaka arrived moments later, carrying the cache of weapons they had come to retrieve. Without hesitation, the team armed themselves. Takadox took a thin, wickedly sharp blade, while Carapar seized a broadsword that seemed built for brute force. Roodaka eagerly equipped herself with a Roodaka launcher, running her fingers over it like she was greeting an old friend. Spiriah was handed a projectile weapon, though Brutaka made a point of warning him with an icy stare that he should be careful where he aimed it. Vezon, meanwhile, turned the spear he had been given over in his hands, inspecting it with mild disappointment. When he finally asked what it did, Brutaka's answer was simple. Nothing. It was just a stick with a sharp end. Vezon, never one to dwell on reality for too long, instantly brightened, deciding that with his supposed powers, he hardly needed a weapon anyway. Lariska, however, had gone still. Her keen senses had caught something. From the cave up ahead, she could hear breathing, but not the kind that belonged to anything natural. It was wet, as if something massive was drawing air through thick, viscous sludge. And beneath it, there was another sound, a low, deliberate slithering. That was when Spiriah stepped back, a rare look of genuine fear flashing across his features. He knew this place. Mutran had spoken of it long ago. Spiriah didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, already prepared to flee. They had to leave, but it was too late. Without warning, the ground trembled and walls of rock erupted from the shoreline, towering over them like a prison formed in an instant. The jagged stone stretched impossibly high, sealing off any chance of retreat. Brutaka, acting on instinct, unleashed the power of his blade against the barrier, but the energy struck the rock and dissipated harmlessly. Spiriah, desperate, shapeshifted his form, sprouting wings in an attempt to fly over the top. He had barely cleared the ground when a spike of stone shot from the peak of the wall, piercing straight through his wing. He spiraled downward, crashing hard against the earth. An ominous voice came next. It was the sound of something ancient and something foul. Brutaka demanded to know what had trapped them here, but his words had barely left his mouth when something massive lashed out from the darkness of the cave. A vast, grotesque tentacle shot forward, coiling around him in an instant. He struggled, but the grip was unyielding. The others barely had time to react before he was yanked into the shadows, vanishing into the cavern's depths. Brutaka found himself face to face with something beyond comprehension. It loomed before him, an abomination beyond words, its form pulsing and shifting with a sickening alien rhythm. It was something that had existed long before the world he knew, something that was never meant to be seen by mortal eyes. This was Tren Krom, the ancient ruler of the universe. Brutaka tried to shut his eyes, but it was futile. The image of Tren Krom had already burned itself into his mind, an undulating, grotesque mass of crimson tentacles pulsing from a gelatinous core. At its center, two lifeless yellow eyes seemed to track his every movement, despite remaining utterly still. Even that brief glance had been enough for Brutaka to understand a terrible truth. Looking upon this entity for too long would shatter his sanity. Brutaka had heard the name Tren Krom before. Myths, ancient whispers of something lurking in the forgotten corners of the universe. But nothing in those stories had prepared him for this. The legend spoke of a being older than Mata Nui himself, an organic anomaly in a universe of biomechanical order. Brutaka struggled against the slimy coil wrapped around him, feeling the thing's presence pushing against his mind. It was trying to pry open his thoughts, to strip away his mental defenses and extract the knowledge buried within. Hesitant footsteps echoed in the chamber. The rest of the team had entered the cave. Even the fearless Carapar seemed uneasy, his usual bravado evaporating in the presence of something so utterly alien. Only Lariska, dagger in hand, held her ground, her sharp eyes darting between the writhing creature and Brutaka's struggle. Tren Krom spoke of a time before Mata Nui, before the Great Spirit was even born, when the Great Beings had created him, not as a ruler but as a caretaker. He had been bound to the heart of the universe, tasked with maintaining its life-sustaining forces. Light, heat, gravity, all of it had once flowed through him. The creature continued, its words laced with bitterness. When Mata Nui had been deemed ready to take his place, a Matoran of light had been sent to deliver the news. Tren Krom had accepted his fate, believing he would be released from his prison. Instead, the Great Beings had cast him aside, bound him to this forsaken rock, and erased him from history. Tren Krom then made his intent clear. The 7 of them would remain here, and their thoughts would be stripped bare. And if, in the process, their minds were broken beyond repair, so be it. Lariska stepped forward. Unlike the others, she did not flinch beneath his gaze. The universe was in danger, she told him. If he had any regard left for the creation he had once shepherded, he would let them go. Tren Krom reacted in an instant. One of his many tendrils lashed out, coiling around Lariska with terrifying speed. Unlike Brutaka, she had no mental defenses, no training to resist an assault on her mind. The entity tore through her memories with ease, forcing her to relive every deception, every betrayal, every kill. she screamed as glimpses of his own ancient thoughts flooded into her. A vast alien intelligence so utterly beyond comprehension that her mind struggled to maintain coherence. When Krom finally released her, she crumpled to the stone floor, barely breathing. The entity rumbled in contemplation, sifting through what he had stolen from her mind. Her name surfaced, one he had not thought of in ages: Mutran. Long ago, Krom had allowed the twisted Makuta scientist to peer into his mind. Mutran had walked away from that encounter with the knowledge he needed to begin the slow undoing of the Great Spirit. It had been a mistake, Krom mused, to allow that exchange. Now, the Makuta had dared to seize power using his knowledge. Brutaka seized the moment. If the Makuta succeeded, he said, Krom would not be left to rot in peace. He would become a threat to their reign, and threats to the Makuta were always eliminated. Krom recoiled at the thought. To Krom, the very idea of his own destruction had been absurd. He was part of this universe. He was this universe. No one could fight him, no one could kill him. He was eternal. But after discovering the sheer scale of the Makuta's plans, for the first time, Krom hesitated. Carapar saw this hesitation as weakness. He raised his sword and brought it down in a powerful arc, confident that he had caught the entity off guard. But a third eye opened on Krom's body, focusing solely on Carapar. Then, a pulse of energy erupted from the eye, engulfing Carapar in a crimson glow. One moment, he was there. The next, he was a cloud of shimmering dust, scattering across the stone floor. With a sudden, effortless motion, he flung Brutaka away like a discarded toy. He released them not as an act of mercy, but as a curse. After seeing what his perfect universe had become, living within it was punishment enough. As the team stumbled onto the shoreline, the towering rock walls that had trapped them here crumbled into nothing. As quick as their legs could take them, they made their escape. Only Takadox hesitated, standing at the edge of the cave, staring into the darkness where Carapar, his ally for nearly 100 millennia, had been reduced to dust. In silence, he wondered how he could enact his revenge against a being older than the universe itself. A few days later, another island loomed before them. Black sand stretched out toward volcanic peaks, and strange, winged rahi cut eerie patterns through the sky. This was their final destination, the island of Teridax. The team disembarked, Brutaka and Spiriah leading the way. The black sand felt oddly unstable beneath their feet, shifting unnaturally as if the island itself resented their presence. The dark grain swirled unnaturally around Spiriah's feet before rising up like liquid, shaping themselves into a massive hand. Before he could react, it closed around him and began pulling him down, the ground itself becoming a living thing, eager to consume him. Brutaka lunged, seizing Spiriah's wrist and digging his heels into the shifting earth. The Makuta thrashed in panic as the sand clawed at his armor, dragging him deeper. Then, with practiced precision, Roodaka fired a Roodaka spinner. The energy struck, and within moments, the sand twisted and writhed, mutating into a chaotic swarm of insects, freeing the Makuta. Brutaka exhaled sharply. He should have realized it sooner. This was Krika's work. The island had been rigged to react to the presence of a Makuta, ensuring that Miserix would never escape. Spiriah wasted no time in declaring his part in this madness over. He had brought them here. That was enough. If they wanted to get themselves killed on Teridax, they could do so without him. Lariska, however, saw things differently. She smirked as an idea took shape, turning to the others. The Skakti, she recalled, had a method for dealing with treacherous terrain. Stalking Kinloka, small, scurrying rodents, were sent ahead of a marching force to trigger traps before their masters reached them. On an island filled with Makuta traps, Spiriah would now become their Kinloka, ensuring their safe passage. Spiriah's eyes burned with fury. But before he could storm off, Brutaka stepped in. There was a bigger picture here. If the Brotherhood of Makuta were to fall, its remnants would need someone to lead them. Those in power would remember who had proven themselves useful in this war, and who had not. The Order of Mata Nui had long memories, and those who cooperated could find themselves with unexpected opportunities. Within moments, Spiriah turned back to the group and declared himself their guide through Teridax. Their path took them up the base of a volcano, where a tunnel had been carved straight through the mountain. Spiriah strode ahead without hesitation, seemingly eager to prove himself useful, when Vezon suddenly darted in front of him, arms raised dramatically. His attention was fixed on a barely visible vine stretched thin across the path. The line extended up the slope, leading to a precarious pile of boulders balanced above them, a crude but effective trap. Spiriah stepped carefully over the trigger, followed by the rest of the group. But one of the group was missing. Lariska turned sharply, scanning the path behind them, then her eyes widened in alarm. Takadox stood at the tunnel's entrance, blade raised high. Then, with a single, decisive swing, he severed the vine. The pile of boulders tumbled downward in a deafening cascade. Takadox was gone, and now they were trapped. Roodaka's fury simmered beneath her usual cold poise. She was already imagining Takadox crushed beneath her heel. Brutaka, however, had no patience for petty revenge. There was a mission to complete. The tunnel stretched on, soon opening into an immense underground cavern. Roodaka voiced the question that had likely been on everyone's mind. What did they intend to do with Miserix once they found him? Why assume he would be willing to help a group like theirs? Brutaka's answer was simple. Miserix's hatred for his former brethren ran deeper than loyalty. If it meant exacting vengeance upon the Brotherhood, the rogue Makuta would fight alongside anyone. Before the conversation could continue, Lariska's sharp senses picked up a distant noise. A rumble, perhaps the volcano, perhaps something else. Then, a tangled mess of branches and leaves began to move and writhe. A sickening realization dawned upon them. Those weren't branches at all. The mass was made up of thousands of crimson insects. The creatures stirred, limbs pulling free from one another as their countless unblinking eyes locked onto the intruders. With horrifying speed, they began to swarm up the cavern walls. With no alternative, Brutaka turned to Spiriah. The Makuta had one talent that might prove useful, his ability to control Rahi. Spiriah didn't comply immediately. He had no interest in following orders, not without something in return. Brutaka had no patience for negotiation. Brutaka summoned his power, opening a dimensional portal just beneath him. The Vortixx swirled hungrily, leading into a realm of beings made of pure light. Reaching out with his power, Spiriah attempted to dominate the insect's will. For a moment, the swarm wavered, their movements faltering. But then, just as suddenly, they surged forward once more. Another presence had already taken hold of them, a force more powerful than his own. The only path forward was through them. Brutaka's energy blast tore through the oncoming tide, Roodaka's Roodaka spinners struck with lethal precision, and Spiriah lashed out with waves of shadow. Roodaka shifted tactics. Her next spinner struck the insects ahead, mutating them into grotesque and unnatural forms. The response was immediate. The swarm recoiled, then turned on their altered brethren, shredding them apart. Wasting no time, Roodaka led the charge through the gap, the others close behind. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber. At its center, a massive figure loomed, bound in thick protodermis chains. The creature's red and silver body was immense, stretching nearly 40 feet in height. Dark energy radiated from the being, its form pulsing with barely contained power. Brutaka took in the sight, knowing without a doubt that they had reached their objective. This was, of course, Miserix. The dragon's eyes locked onto the intruders, assessing them with something between curiosity and disdain. Brutaka took a step forward, cautious but unwavering. The mention of Teridax shifted something in the air. The very mention of his usurper's name sent a ripple of fury through the former ruler, and, for the first time in ages, the chains trembled beneath his strength. The tension grew as Miserix's gaze fell on Spiriah, who had lingered in the shadows, hoping to escape notice. It was a foolish hope. Miserix had no interest in mercy. Dark tendrils shot from the Makuta's chest, wrapping around Spiriah before he could react. There was no struggle, no scream, just a moment of sheer terror before he was gone, pulled into Miserix's very essence, consumed without hesitation. Even Vezon, usually the first to fill any gap with his rambling nonsense, stood motionless. Brutaka knew there was no point in threats or persuasion. Miserix would not be intimidated. He was driven by only one thing: vengeance, and Brutaka could offer him the means to claim it. The dragon considered the offer carefully. The thought of destroying Teridax and the traitorous Brotherhood burned in his mind. He had spent eons in chains, awaiting his chance to make the universe remember his name, and now that moment had finally arrived. But first, the chains. Brutaka and Roodaka combined their strength, striking at the weakest link with continuous bursts of energy and shadow. The chains resisted at first, but slowly they began to weaken. Then, at last, the first link snapped. Miserix's roar echoed through the island, a sound of both agony and triumph. The Clack guards reacted instantly, surging toward them in a frenzy. The Makuta's fury erupted in an instant. With a single, deafening bellow, he unleashed his own sonic power, a wave of destruction that sent the Clack tumbling from the air, lifeless. Miserix was free. The island would not hold him any longer. Miserix stretched his newly formed wings, blasting open a hole in the roof and stepping into the open air for the first time in millennia. With a single mighty leap, they ascended, soaring above Teridax. The ship was gone. Takadox had fled, as expected. But in the grand scheme of things, he was nothing. The storm was coming. The fate of the universe was shifting. And as Miserix turned north, toward the Brotherhood that had betrayed him, one thing was certain: Miserix's vengeful wrath could not be contained.